Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Dahlgren Chapel of the Sacred Heart, the spiritual heart of our Georgetown University community. For all those present here in person and all those who are with us virtually, welcome to our Dahlgren Sacred Lecture. My name is Mark Bosco, Vice President for Mission and Ministry, and I wish to thank you for joining us for our Fall 22 series. This lecture is a signature event of our annual celebration of Jesuit Heritage Month. Each November, Georgetown offers various programs for students, faculty, staff to engage and understand more fully the Jesuit heritage and values that have shaped our university for 200 years. This Jesuit tradition of education has always prized the pursuit of both truth and virtue. It is the transformation of the whole person, from ignorance to understanding, from isolation to dialogue, from indifference to moral responsibility. The Sacred Lecture Series was inaugurated to continue a Jesuit tradition practiced by Ignatius of Loyola and his early companions. Jesuits would offer lectures outside the context of worship, with the intent to inform and edify those seeking to grow in faith, hope, and love. Meant to be accessible to a wider audience, these lectures were a staple of Jesuit pastoral practice in both their schools and their churches. In that same spirit and style, we've adapted this tradition to meet the needs of our current moment, seeking out distinguished speakers engaged with topics related to spirituality, social justice, and the Jesuit intellectual tradition. The program, as you see, lists our past lecturers, all of which are archived on our website. Today we are honored to have with us Father Brian McDermott of the Society of Jesus. Father McDermott shares some interesting facts on the Georgetown Jesuit Community website. He writes, quote, "I left Georgetown as an undergrad at the end of my sophomore year, right after my last exam. I went that very day to Montreal to get on a Dutch cargo ship and go on an Ignatian pilgrimage with other Georgetown students and two Jesuits. It was the summer of 1956, the anniversary of St. Ignatius's death. I entered the Jesuits that September. Little did I realize how involved with Georgetown I would later be. I thought I had given up GU for good, but I was on the board of directors for 19 years, the rector of the Jesuit community here from 2000 to 2006, and now I'm working for President de Joya as a special assistant. I feel very blessed indeed," unquote. So that was a nice, to use your own words, of Father Brian. Father Brian's scholarship and teaching is in systematic theology, specifically centered on Ignatian spirituality. Brian has served as the academic dean of the Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then served as religious superior there and at Georgetown and at Loyola University, Maryland. Brian is a highly regarded and sought-after spiritual director, having guided countless Jesuits, other religious, and lay people into a profound experience of God through the spiritual exercises all over his lifetime. Father Brian's talk is entitled, "Setting Captives Free, the Spiritual Exercises and America's Original Sin." Please join me in welcoming him to the AMBO.
Thank you, Father Mark, for that introduction, and welcome everybody. Thank you for braving the weather, the November weather we finally have, and joining us here. I'm very honored indeed to be involved here with the Sacred Lecture. The list, the roster of those who precede me is stunning, and I especially want to note two of my esteemed Jesuit brothers, John O'Malley and Howard Gray, and of course, most recently, President de Joya. We gather here in Dahlgren Chapel this afternoon on the eve of the anniversary of the assassination of the 6 Jesuits and their housekeeper and her daughter on the grounds of the University of Central America in El Salvador in 1989. Those 6 Jesuits were all prominent scholars and men deeply fashioned by the spiritual exercises. One of them, Ignatius Spiritual, was president of the university and a very significant philosopher and theologian. A recent work by Professor Matthew Ashley of the University of Notre Dame carefully studies the writings of Eucharia, Karl Rahner, and Pope Francis to come to a richer understanding of the influence of Ignatian spirituality on the theology of all three. In Eucharia's case, Ashley shows how this thinker and activist was transformed by the exercises and then in turn adapted the Ignatian spiritual program to the situation in Latin America. He principally adapted it by refashioning the second week, when the one making the exercises engages in interaction with the Jesus of the ministry. He helped many appreciate the fact that Jesus' engagement with individuals and groups in his ministry was also a deep engagement with the social structures of his time, and that the programmatic meditations, such as the call of the King and the two standards, could be interpreted in ways that put greater emphasis on Jesus' struggle with the forces and powers that strive to keep people in their marginalized and oppressed conditions. This afternoon, I would like to explore with you a recent attempt in the Washington area to adapt portions of the exercises to help those making them to confront the twin scourges of anti-Black racism and white privilege. I see this development as a modest but potentially fruitful way of orienting the exercises to engage more explicitly and more fully with the racist social structures that are so prevalent in American society and have so tragically been part of the history of the Maryland province of the Jesuits and of this university. I divide this presentation into 3 parts. The first will briefly describe the origin of this retreat. I will then highlight the principal ways in which we adapted the exercises to help retreatants pray about their involvement with racism. Finally, I would like to offer some reflections on the transformation of the self that is required to engage with these deeply harmful structures, and how the depth of transformation called for can help us to appreciate how the Ignatian spiritual tradition can be complemented by drawing on dimensions of the Carmelite tradition. In 2017, a group was formed in this part of the Ignatian world called the Washington Area Ministers of Ignatian Spirituality. WAMIS, not the most compelling acronym. It consisted of representatives from the 7 Ignatian apostolates in the greater Washington area and the assistant to the Jesuit provincial for spirituality. The founding desire of the group was to begin to overcome the perceived silo character of the apostolates with regard to Ignatian spirituality, hoping to find ways to collaborate in making available the resources of this rich tradition. The group met for several years, essentially engaging in faith sharing and exploring ways to collaborate. Nothing really ignited for the group until the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020 and all the protests and turmoil that tragic event stirred up. A shift occurred in the group that we later attributed to the Holy Spirit. Members experienced themselves as being led to ask how the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius might be adapted to provide assistance to those who wanted to engage the issues of anti-Black racism and white privilege in a spiritual way. That is, in a way that allowed God to provide what only God can provide when seeking to address these deep issues of our society. Over a year or so, we developed an adaptation of the early phases of St. Ignatius' Spiritual Exercises. Looking back on the province, we appreciate that when the time was ripe, we were given the light to proceed, light that we sensed was good and right and trustworthy. I like to think that we were being prepared for the light in the couple of years of meeting and praying and waiting. We didn't allow our desire to appear competent, relevant, or resourceful, at least in our own eyes, to take over. We held steady until a light was given us. I see now that we will be given a way of proceeding that would prove crucial for those who make this retreat. I'd like now to explore three main ways in which we adapted the spiritual exercise of St. Ignatius for our purposes. As you know, Ignatius foresaw the spiritual exercises being given in two different ways. The first way was in the form of individuals going away to a secluded place and devoting around 30 days to the making of the retreat. The one making the exercises, the exercitant, would meet with a spiritual guide each day. The full exercises would always include, in addition to the 4 weeks of scripture-based prayer, consideration of the principle and foundation, with its emphasis on the need for interior freedom, as well as on the desire to seek what is more conducive to the end for which we are created, the famous magis. Essential as well were the guidelines for discerning spirits and discerning God's will, and for making the election, whatever deep choice God was calling the exercitant to make during the retreat. Ignatius intended the full exercises for those Christians who were deeply generous of heart and who were marked with an adventurous and entrepreneurial spirit. The second way of presenting the exercises is an adapted form. In the 19th annotation, of course, in the text of the exercises, Ignatius offers the opportunity to make the full exercises not at a retreat house, but during ordinary life. And in the 18th annotation, he adapts the exercises even more by giving to individuals practices from its early phases that help them reform their lives and prepare them for the celebration of the sacrament of penance. In our day, the adaptation has takes so many more forms. Here at Georgetown, the adaptation can occur as one-day retreat or weekend, or 5 or 8 day retreat, or 6 or 8 week retreat. There seems to be no limit to the adaptations possible. We envisioned a 5-week retreat, with the retreatant praying 30 minutes a day. And the retreatants met in small groups 6 times. We named the retreat Setting Captives Free, Racism, I, You, and God's Liberating Grace. So far, about 80 individuals have made the retreat. The first major adaptation was that, unlike most Ignatian retreats, no spiritual or retreat direction is offered. All the retreatants agree to meet in cohorts that come together each week for 90 minutes. Instead of retreat directors, there are 2 co-facilitators assigned to each small group. The co-facilitators, who are folks who themselves have made the retreat, offer over the course of the 90 minutes 4 questions to the group, allowing time for each question to be addressed by each retreatant. The 4 questions are these: how are you as you come today to this group? 2, what is the Spirit inviting you to share with the group about the past week's experience of the retreat? 3, what have you heard the group say? What resonates with you? What patterns do you notice? And 4th, in what you have heard, what invitation or invitations do you notice for yourself or for the group with regard to the way you are participating in the retreat? This is the same structure at each of the meetings except the first. which is devoted to introductions of the retreatants and some basic instruction about ways of praying during the retreat. In the 4 iterations of this retreat so far, and the 4th is concluding actually this week, Martina O'Shea and I have had the opportunity to debrief all the co-facilitators after each small group session while preserving the necessary confidentiality, as well as engaging in co-facilitation ourselves. It is simply remarkable how quickly and deeply a spirit of trust developed in these groups. Often members did not know each other prior to the retreat, but their own longing to engage with God about this burning issue of our time, and their sharing early on about their experience of God's love for them, which we will speak about in a moment, helped to fashion a genuine we from the I plus I plus I at the beginning of the process. The safety that was established by both the structure and the members allowed them to be appropriately vulnerable and honest with one another, and it seemed as though they were able to not get ahead of the grace that they were being offered at any particular time in the retreat. The structure and the process worked. The second adaptation occurred in the first week of the retreat, when the grace asked for is the one proper to the so-called preparatory or disposition days that precede the first week meditations of the full exercises. St. Ignatius' text does not include preparation days, but begins with the principle and foundation consideration. But we know that St. Ignatius spent considerable time with those who were going to embark on the full exercises, often for months and months. Students of Ignatian spirituality have surmised that he probably devoted those initial meetings to teaching the individual forms of prayer that would be suitable during the 4 weeks, particularly Lectio Divina and imaginative contemplation of gospel scenes. It has also been surmised that he would invite the person to prayerfully review their life story, asking to be shown how God was showing God's love for them during the circumstances of their lives. Such revelation would deepen their trust in God and trust their trust in God's love for them, and provide the motor, the engine, the energy, the blessed energy for the rest of the retreat. And such a preparatory grace, receiving that experience of God's unconditional love at the very beginning, asking for it at least, and waiting on it, puts everything in good perspective for the individual retreatant. We do not initiate the journey to God. God is always the initiator, even if we are not always explicitly aware of that. Exploring our grace history makes abundantly clear to us that we are the ones being sought by God. God is in love with us, not because of who we are, but because God is who God is. Deeply tasting this powerful truth of our lives, that we are unconditionally loved, provides, as I mentioned, the energy or the motor for the rest of the exercises. The grace sought in this first week is this: we ask for the grace to experience God's love for me, for those whom I know, for the whole human race, for all the social institutions that support and express authentic human flourishing, for our home planet Earth, and for the cosmos and all its processes. Beginning the retreat this way helps the experience from being a moralistic exercise of shoulds and oughts. By asking God for the grace to experience God's love at the very start, the retreatants are positioning themselves to be led and guided by God's Spirit, and to not make their own self-reflection the engine that drives these weeks. And it makes all the difference in the world to ask someone to reveal to you your woundedness, which happens early on in the retreat, when you have recently experienced that revealer as loving you unconditionally. Over my years at Georgetown, I have witnessed how deeply affected faculty, staff, and students have been as a result of asking for and then experiencing the grace of God's unconditional love for them. It makes all the difference not only for their experience in the retreat, but in their own personal lives. The third adaptation involved our spreading out the grace of the first week of the full exercises of Ignatius into 3 interrelated graces. Each of the second, third, and fourth weeks of the Setting Captives Free retreat includes a distinctive grace. Those of you here who have given the spiritual exercises or have read the text or have made the exercises would probably agree with me that the first week, as Ignatius composed it, is the most challenging of the 4. Not only is the theme of the week, my sinfulness, dark and troubling, but much of the rhetoric of the week stresses what the retreatant is called to do as a person of prayer. I apply myself to the subject matter, my understanding to the subject matter, and arouse the affections of the heart with my will. I meditate on my history of sin, and so on. To be sure, as a retreatant, I regularly ask for a grace from God, so that God will act in my favor. And Ignatius invites the retreatant to make colloquies with God and Jesus and Mary. But the reader of Ignatius' text of the first week, if you just read the text through, I don't recommend that you do it if you haven't done it. It's a tough read. I just have to, and I love Ignatius, I love the exercise. The first week he's composed it is a tough read. One was tempted to think that the retreatant's the principal agent in the first week. And I wonder if the Inquisition was on his mind in some way, because he was very, very sensitive about talking about sin and what authority he had to talk about sin. And so maybe he was having a rhetoric of caution in this week. If you've ever read Seven Storey Mountain, Thomas Merton, when he was a graduate student at Columbia University, he bought a copy of St. Ignatius' text. Don't do this. He bought a copy, and in his room decided to make the full exercises. And when he came to the full first week and was trying to make a retreat out of it, he said he wanted to throw the book out the window. There's an oral tradition that surrounds the text that is absolutely essential. And part of that oral tradition, as I said, comes back to what we surmise were his practices that are not found in the book, but gave the context to put everything in the proper light. And since Vatican II, we've refound that oral tradition in a way that has made the exercises an organic process where we're always being led by God and always open to revelation, and then offering, with God's grace, proper response. We articulate the grace in the original exercises into 3 graces. The grace of God's revelation to us, of how I and we are complicit and influenced by sinful social structures that support and express racism and the harm that it does. The next week, asking for humility and contrition for this complicity. And then thirdly, the next week, asking for the beginning of transformation from one who was complicit to one who was able to contribute to a transformed world. Thus, revelation, humility, and contrition, the beginnings of transformation. The request for God's revelation to the retreatant of their sinfulness is not found explicitly in Ignatius' text. I like to think that it's implicitly there, implicitly present, because the grace of revelation is pivotal if the retreatant's engagement with their woundedness is not going to be mired in moralism or self-centered guilt feelings. There are proper guilt feelings, but there are guilt feelings where we just get mired in ourselves, and that's not grace, but disgrace, ungrace. When individuals make the full exercises and ask for revelation from God of where in their lives they are ripe for purification or conversion, they are asking for this grace from the one whose unconditional love they experienced in the preparatory days. And what is shown to them can come to them as a surprise. While the individual may want to focus on their own usual set, their own usual memory of their sins, which often leads nowhere, what God will uncover instead very often is something underlying that pattern of woundedness or sin, such as a deep paralysis or apathy or fear or unfreedom that lies deeper. That is the hope for even a short retreat such as our own. The third week of the retreat focuses the grace in a way that reflects Ignatius' grace in the text of the exercises. I and we ask for the grace of humility and genuine contrition, but now for our participation in and complicity with harmful social structures. The request for humility connects this week with the previous one. The gift of humility is the gift of truthful self-knowledge, particularly with regard to my life as permeated by complicity with racist social structures. That is the proper theme of this retreat. And the sorrow and contrition asked for have a chance of being organic, of flowing out of me because of the grace of the first week of the retreat, experiencing God's unconditional love. This grace has awakened me to a fresh relationship with myself and with those who are in my life, close by or at a distance. The contrition is a strong indicator that God's grace is starting to pierce the destructive normalcy of everyday, unreflected upon racism. The retreatant experiences holy discomfort as the Spirit continues to show how embedded the retreatant is in these deadly social structures. The third grace is phrased this way: I and we ask for the grace of God's ongoing transformation and liberation of me and of us as enablers of racism, and the wisdom to be able to contribute to the transformation of aspects of those structures that we are involved in, led by the Holy Spirit, the divine connector. There is a certain logic to the placing of this grace after the grace of revelation and the grace of humility contrition. And retreatants ask for this grace of being engaged in transformation. But what has become apparent to us who are co-facilitators was that too often two significant movements happened in many of the retreatants while they were engaging with their complicity with racist social structures. The first movement was the emergence of a kind of impatience in some of the retreatants after the revelation of their complicity and after they had started feeling contrite. A number of the folks began saying they wanted to become part of the solution to racism rampant in our world and wanted help from God to become agents in relation to this massive issue of our time. And then a second movement would develop soon after that. The recognition that anti-racism prayer and anti-racism work were long-term efforts. One retreatant spoke about the realization during the retreat that racist attitudes in him were hard-baked and that God would need to do a lot of work to bring him to a place where he could be a source of help in this whole arena. A 5-week retreat was the beginning of a deep process. The wish to feel good about oneself, namely that I am not just be part of the problem but part of the solution, had to yield to humble acknowledgement that I have a way to go in becoming part of the new creation. This was a very sobering awakening for a number of retreatants. During the last week of the retreat, the retreatants prayed over the graces of the entire retreat. And in the last meeting, the last group meeting, they named their gifts. And many of them indeed received the grace of experiencing God's unconditional love for themselves and the world, grace revelation of their complicity, some humility, genuine humility and contrition, and some indeed the desire for, and many of them a desire for transformation. But they all realized, or all of them I'd say realized as they came out of the retreat, that they are inaugurating or deepening an already begun process of conversion that will have to go on and on. We offered scripture texts for each day of the retreat, proper to the grace being asked for in that week, and we also gave them supplemental materials to help them either during their prayer time or to nourish their imagination and their hearts outside the formal prayer periods. These supplementary materials included prose selections, poetry, art, and music. Among the authors and artists from whom resources were drawn were James Cone, Howard Thurman, Nahishi Coates, Isabel Wilkinson, Robin DiAngelo, Renee Watson, Martin Luther King Jr., Thea Bowman, Alfred Delp, Langston Hughes. Portions of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's Mass in the World is prayed here at Georgetown, art by Mark Bradford, and music by the Soweto Gospel Choir. I'd now like to shift gears a bit. I think it's safe to say that most individuals leaving the Setting Captives Free retreat have a chastened view of things and of themselves. They've been given to see that their embeddedness in racist structures is not a problem that can simply be solved, but is a deep-running condition that requires patient relating to. This particular retreat is focused on the early phases of the spiritual exercises, and properly so. But it is, of course, possible to make the entire spiritual exercises with a focus on God's liberating love at work in Jesus and in his companions and disciples. It is not a difficult task to transform or refashion the second, third, and fourth weeks of the exercises to assist someone to grow in companion with Jesus as he gathers disciples and heals those who are blind or paralyzed or discouraged, to remain with him as he dies on the lynching tree of the cross and experiences being raised by God and thereby becoming the source of spiritual consolation and strength for those who continue to be his tangible presence in history and who want to share more deeply in his liberating mission. But friends, it can happen for those who engage in the struggle for racial justice in our society that they come to the point where they find themselves feeling as though their efforts are outmatched by the forces with which they are contending. They can discover the hard way that all their competence, all their life experience, all their knowledge is woefully inadequate to the challenges posed by the deep-seated racism in our country. Simply put, they have come to an impasse. A number of American theologians have recently devoted important attention to the experience of impasse. In 2009, it became the theme of the annual convention of the Catholic Theological Society of America when Father Brian Massingale was the planner of the convention. And a recently published volume featuring essays by 10 Catholic theologians was dedicated to exploring theology in a time of impasse. Both the theme of the CTSA convention and the theological volume were inspired by the work of a nun, Sister Constance Fitzgerald, a Discalced Carmelite belonging to the Baltimore Carmelite Monastery in Towson, Maryland. Her seminal article on impasse and dark night was published in 1984 and has exerted immense influence on many individuals and communities around the globe. Her keynote address at the CTSA convention was a development of that earlier article. This is how Sister Connie describes impasse. By impasse, I mean there is no way out, no way around, no rational escape from what imprisoned one, no possibilities in the situation. In a true impasse, every normal manner of acting is brought to a standstill, And ironically, impasse is experienced not only in the problem in itself, but also in any solution rationally attempted. Every logical solution remains unsatisfying at the very least. The whole life situation suffers a depletion, has the word limits written upon it. Dorothea Söderler describes it as unavoidable suffering, an apt symbol of which is physical imprisonment, which is the experience of being squeezed into a confined space. Any movement out, any next step is canceled. And the most dangerous temptation is to give up, to quit, to surrender to cynicism and despair in the face of the disappointment, disenchantment, hopelessness, and loss of meaning that encompasses one. I see two fronts, as it were, to impasse when it concerns the struggle against anti-black racism and white privilege. The first front is the seeming intractability of racism as present in our culture, in our systems, in the way institutions in our country are shaped by racist attitudes. The second front is myself, is each of us as persons. The reach of racism and white privilege in us white folks in this country penetrates our conscious selves and reaches down into our unconscious. The self that I, Brian McDermott, have constructed over the many decades of my life, my sense of myself, is made up of myriad strands, some of which are blessing, and others of which are the impact on me of negative attitudes, values, and ways of acting that have shaped me by the deep kind of mimesis studied so acutely by observers such as René Girard and James Allison. Impasse can confront us on each and both of these fronts, the societal and the personal, and they're deeply intertwined. When we begin to taste these impasses, we have a choice to make: to choose apathy, escape, despair, repression, denial, or an endless array of false and inadequate solutions, or to let ourselves experience in its fullness the intractability of our situation and our seeming abject powerlessness in the situation. The old self, the old creation that helped create the situation of impasse cannot be the self that can give rise to the emergence of the new creation. Both societal impasse and the personal impasse require that we cease to be agents of change, providers of solutions, the way we were before. We are called to stop demanding answers and engage in deep listening. We're invited to reach out from our place of darkness and seeming powerlessness to the only one who can give us a new self, a new consciousness, a new being, that will in turn give us hints and guesses, and perhaps more than hints and guesses, about how next to proceed. This is a process in which many hopes in the plural need to die, need to be surrendered, so that a hoping beyond particular describable hopes can emerge, a hoping that is dark and mysterious, and that originates in the infinite holy mystery and terminates in the infinite holy mystery. Sister Connie presents the teaching of St. John of the Cross in a way that makes clear that what he offers us is not simply guidance for rare spiritual souls experiencing certain kinds of dark nights, but wisdom that can illuminate what many thoughtful and engaged people are experiencing in our time, the encounter with impasse within themselves and in the world surrounding them. Now, it's important to not misunderstand what Sister Connie is saying. She's not inviting us into a phase of inaction, an extended kind of pause in our efforts to educate ourselves about racism and white privilege, in our efforts to grow in loving solidarity with victims of racism, in our efforts to form community with others who are seeking to become part of the new creation. The losing of a kind of self, the letting go of a certain kind of mode of living, with the hope of opening up space for the emergence of a new self, a new life. That is familiar gospel territory, isn't it? But each time we actually are invited into that territory, it can be fear-producing. We can find ourselves resisting big time. We can draw on the wisdom of a John of the Cross, as interpreted by prophetic voices such as Sister Connie, to learn how to stay in that space of not knowing, that space of relative incompetence, that space of the beginner's mind. I have no doubt that St. Ignatius, great mystic that he was, had to learn to negotiate space like this in his own life. But much of his spiritual guidance is directed to those who are beginning their spiritual journeys. Over recent centuries, Carmelites have gratefully learned from the wellsprings of Ignatian spirituality about very fundamental themes in the spiritual life. How to develop a personal relationship with Christ, how to become materially free, how to discern spirits, and to discern God's will. In this connection, please note that John of the Cross went to a Jesuit secondary school, and Teresa prayed major elements of the spiritual exercises under the guidance of 2 young Jesuits. We who have been principally shaped by Ignatius have much to learn from the Carmelite tradition as we keep learning just how pervasive racism and white privilege are in our world and in ourselves. As I come to the conclusion of this presentation, I want to acknowledge that I have invited you into a very detailed consideration of a new adaptation of the spiritual exercises. This gift of Ignatius to the Church does not consist, for the most part, in the stating of theological truths or considerations of a theoretical sort. The exercises are a set of concrete and specific practices, and that is what's genial about this classic text. Each of the practices counts, and the order in which they are presented matters. These practices help a retreatant to show up with God and to relate to Christ in the power of the Spirit, with the hope that God will do the transforming work. Friends, I acknowledge it's only a 5-week retreat. It is mustard seed labor. But any effort to cooperate with God's infinite energy of love and light is worth the venture, especially when we are seeking to be part of the new creation that God yearns for, a new creation that can only emerge if there is a dismantling of the pernicious social structures of anti-Black racism and white privilege. Thank you for your kind attention.